The rain had been falling for nearly an hour before Donnelly finally looked up from her needlework and noticed the cowboy standing outside her shop window, still as a fence post and twice as stubborn, his hat brim channeling a steady stream of water down onto the muddy boardwalk of Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1879. She had not asked him to wait. She had not asked him anything at all, in point of fact, because John Granger was the sort of man who made a woman feel that asking was unnecessary, the sort of man who simply saw what needed doing and did it without fanfare or expectation of reward. He had ridden into Caldwell 3 months prior on a big roan gelding with a bedroll tied behind the saddle, and a reputation that had preceded him from Dodge City, in the form of a letter of introduction, tucked inside the breast pocket of a coat that had seen considerably better days. He had taken a job at the Hennessy cattle operation south of town, and he had been quietly, persistently, and perhaps a little hopelessly in love with Donnelly, ever since the first afternoon he walked into her dress shop to order a simple blouse for his younger sister back in Missouri. Had been 24 years old that September afternoon, a woman of Irish descent with dark auburn hair and green eyes that held the particular light of someone who had survived considerable difficulty and come out the other side of it still standing, still sharp, still capable of a smile that could stop a man in his tracks at 50 paces. She had come to Caldwell 2 years earlier with her father, Patrick Donnelly, a tailor of some skill who had believed with his whole stubborn Irish heart that a small cattle town on the edge of the prairie needed good clothes and was willing to pay for them. He had been right about the need. He had not survived long enough to see the shop truly flourish, having passed from a fever in the winter of Maria's first year in Kansas, leaving her the shop, a small house 2 streets over, a sewing machine that was the finest thing either of them had owned, and a debt to the town bank that she had been quietly, steadily paying down ever since. The shop was called Donnelly's Fine Goods, and it was the only dress shop for 40 miles in any direction. Maria did alterations. She made shirts and trousers for the ranch hands who needed something presentable for Sunday. She took orders for formal gowns from the wives of cattlemen who wanted to feel civilized in a town that was still largely making up its mind about what it intended to be. She was good at her work. She was better than good. She had learned from her father, and then she had surpassed him in the delicacy of her stitching and the accuracy of her eye. And the women of Caldwell knew it. And the ranchers' wives came from as far as Wellington to have Donnelly fit their daughters for the dresses they would be married in. She had not herself had time to think much about marriage. John Granger had changed the nature of her thinking considerably, though she had not told him so. He was 27, lean and weather-darkened, with quiet gray eyes and hands that were rough from rope work but careful in everything they touched. He had come into the shop that first day and stood awkwardly near the door, turning his hat in his hands, and explained in a low, careful voice that his sister Clara was 16 and had never owned a blouse that fit her properly, and he wanted to send her something good. Maria had taken his order without ceremony, measured the specifications he provided as best he could describe them, and charged him a fair price. He had paid without complaint, which was already more than she could say for half her customers. He had come back a week later to collect the blouse, and he had looked at it with such quiet gratitude that Maria had felt something shift unexpectedly in her chest. He had come back the week after that with no apparent reason, hat in hand again, asking if she might have anything suitable for a man to wear to the church social. She had measured him herself that time, standing close enough to smell horses and leather and something that was not unpleasant underneath it all, and she had been more flustered than she would have admitted to anyone living. He had attended the church social in a new shirt that she had cut and sewn herself, and he had danced exactly once, with the minister's wife, because he was the kind of man who thought it was the right thing to do, and then he had stood near the wall and talked to old Tom Fremont about cattle prices, and Maria had watched him from across the room without meaning to, without wanting to, and she had been thoroughly irritated with herself for the rest of the evening. That was the beginning of September. By October, he had a habit of passing by the shop on his way to the feed store on Fridays, and he would stop and look in through the window and raise his hat if she was visible, and sometimes she would come to the door and they would talk briefly about nothing in particular: the weather, the price of cattle, whether old Haskell's dog had gotten out again and terrorized Mrs. Pettigrew's garden. It was pleasant. It was infuriatingly pleasant, and Maria found that she was aware of Friday mornings with an anticipation she did not fully want to examine. She was aware, too, of the practical difficulties of her situation. She was an Irish Catholic woman running a business alone in a Protestant Kansas cattle town, and she had worked very hard to be taken seriously, to be seen as capable and self-sufficient rather than as a woman who needed managing. She had watched enough women in Caldwell be absorbed into marriages that seemed to reduce rather than expand them, and she had made a quiet promise to herself that she would not be absorbed by anything or anyone. She was her father's daughter, stubborn and proud, and she did not ask for help she did not need, and she did not invite complications she could not afford. John Granger complicated things simply by existing in her general vicinity. On the first Friday of November, 1879, the rain came early and hard, the kind of cold plains rain that arrived without much warning and turned the main street of Caldwell into a navigational challenge involving mud that could swallow a boot hole. Maria had a customer that afternoon, Mrs. Eleanor Hatch, whose husband ran the largest feed operation in the county, and who had decided with some urgency that she needed a new dress for her nephew's wedding in Wichita at the end of the month. Mrs. Hatch was a pleasant but meticulous woman who required careful management, and Maria had been at her sewing table since 7 that morning, getting the blue silk that Eleanor had shipped in from Kansas City properly prepared. And by the time the fitting was done and Mrs. Hatch had gone home satisfied, the afternoon had gone gray and wet, and Maria was tired in her bones. She was tidying the shop, rolling the remaining silk and storing it in the cedar chest her father had built in the first week they arrived in Caldwell, when she happened to look toward the front window and saw him. John Granger was standing on the boardwalk outside her shop in the rain. He was not sheltered under the awning. The awning over Donnelly's fine goods extended perhaps 4 feet from the front of the building, and he was standing beyond its reach, his hat brimmed dark with water, his coat soaked through at the shoulders, his boots planted in the mud at the edge of the boardwalk. He was not looking in through the window. He was looking down the street with the patient, settled expression of a man who had decided to be somewhere and intended to stay there. Maria stood very still and stared at him for a moment. Then she went to the door and opened it. "John Granger," she said, "what on earth are you doing standing in the rain?" He turned at the sound of her voice. The water was running off his hat in a thin stream and his coat was dark with it, but his expression was perfectly composed, with a flicker of something behind it that might have been sheepishness if he had been a man who indulged in that kind of thing. "Waiting," he said simply. "Waiting," she repeated. "For what?" "For you to finish up. I thought I would walk you home." He said it the way he said most things, without decoration, without performance, like it was a reasonable and obvious thing. "It's raining." Maria looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. The water was dripping from his coat onto the boards at his feet, and the wind was picking up, carrying the cold edge of genuine November with it. "I did not ask you to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "You didn't." There was a pause. The rain fell steadily between them. "You are soaking wet," she said. "Yes." "How long have you been standing there?" He considered this with what appeared to be genuine thoughtfulness. "About an hour, I expect." Something happened in Maria Donnelly's chest then that she did not have a word for. It was not gratitude exactly, and it was not irritation, though it contained something of both. It was more like the feeling of a door that she had kept carefully latched for 2 years shifting slightly on its hinges, not opening, not yet, but moving, acknowledging the possibility of movement. "Come inside," she said, stepping back from the door. "I have a stove." He came inside, dripping on the threshold, and she brought him a towel from the back room, and he dried his face and the back of his neck with the careful economy of a man who did not want to take more than was offered. She made him stand near the small iron stove in the corner while she finished putting the shop to rights, and she tried very hard not to notice the way the firelight caught the angles of his face, or the way he looked around her shop with quiet, genuine interest, studying the bolts of cloth and the patterned papers pinned to the wall board, and the half-finished dress on the dressmaker's form in the corner as though they were worthy of his attention. "That's a fine piece of work," he said, nodding at the dress on the form. It was the beginning of Mrs. Hatch's blue silk. Only the bodice fitted so far, but the seaming was precise and the darts were set with the kind of care that most people would not notice, but that Marya noticed because she had put them there. "Thank you," she said. "You made everything in here, most of it. Some of the men's ready-made I order in from Topeka. The women's things I make myself. Your father taught you." She paused in folding a length of muslin and looked at him. "Some of it. I learned the rest myself." She set the muslin on the shelf. "How do you know about my father?" "Small town," he said. "People talk. I know he passed 2 winters ago. I'm sorry for it." Marya nodded, accepting the condolence without deflecting from it the way she sometimes did when people mentioned Patrick Donnelly and she was not prepared for it. There was something in the plainness of John's sympathy that made it easier to receive than the elaborate condolences she sometimes got from people who did not quite know what to do with grief and so dressed it in too many words. "He was a good man," she said. "He would have liked Caldwell given more time. And you? Do you like it?" She thought about it honestly, which surprised her. "I like the shop," she said. "I like having built something. I miss other things sometimes. The green of Ireland, though I was only 6 when we left it. My mother is still in St. Louis with my aunt. I miss her." She stopped herself, slightly surprised by how much she had said. "Are you always this easy to talk to?" He looked at her with those quiet gray eyes, and something in them shifted just slightly, something warm. "People tell me I'm not easy to talk to at all," he said. "Then perhaps I'm the exception," she said, and she was not quite sure why she said it, only that it was true. She locked up the shop, and he walked with her through the rain, the two of them under the single umbrella she kept on a hook by the door, which was not quite wide enough for 2 people to walk comfortably side by side without their shoulders touching, and she was very aware of his shoulder against hers, warm even through the wet wool of his coat. He matched his pace to hers on the muddy street, steadied her once with a hand at her elbow when she nearly turned her ankle on a loose board, and released her elbow immediately when she was steady again, not making more of the contact than it was, not making less of it either. At the door of her house he stopped, and she turned to face him. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle and the light was going fast from the sky. "Thank you," she said, "for walking me home." "Glad to," he said. He put his hat back on, which he had been carrying under the umbrella, and the brim settled into its familiar line. "Good night, Miss Donnelly." "Good night, Mr. Granger." She went inside. She stood just inside the closed door for a moment with her hand still on the latch, listening to the sound of his boots on the boardwalk as he walked away, and the sound diminished and was gone, and the rain went on falling. She stood there for quite a long time. The following Friday he was at the feed store at the same time. She was returning from the post office with a parcel of trim she had ordered from Kansas City, and he fell into step beside her without preamble and walked with her back to the shop and helped her carry the parcel inside, and then stood for a moment in the doorway with his hat in his hands. "Would you take coffee with me?" he asked. "At Ella's. Saturday morning if you're free." Ella's was the small eating house 2 doors down from the barber shop, run by a widow named Ella Fisher, who made coffee so strong it could stand a spoon upright, and pie that was the best thing available in the county. Taking coffee at Ella's on a Saturday morning was a public thing, a visible thing, the kind of thing that people in Caldwell would notice and remark upon. Marya was aware of all of this. "Yes," she said, "I think I could manage that." He looked at her for a moment as though making sure she meant it. Then he smiled, and it was not a large smile, not the big performed grin of a man who wanted to charm, but something quieter and more genuine than that, something that rearranged his whole face in a way that did something inadvisable to Maria's composure. "Saturday, then," he said. 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock, she agreed. He was at Ella's at 5 minutes to 8, standing outside the door, and the fact that he was early and not late was a thing Maria noted with a private, precise appreciation that she would not have been able to fully articulate, but that had to do with her belief that a person's character was most visible in the small things. Ella Fisher seated them at the window table, which was the best table, and she brought coffee and apple pie without being asked, and she exchanged a look with Maria over John's head that contained approximately 17 different observations, all of which Maria ignored with what she felt was admirable dignity. They talked for 2 hours. Maria had not expected to talk for 2 hours. She had prepared herself for a pleasant and somewhat careful 45 minutes, after which they would each go about their separate days, and she would feel that she had been appropriately social and not impulsive. But the coffee at Ella's was very good, and John Granger turned out to have a quality that she had not anticipated, which was that he listened. He listened the way most people did not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually attending to what she said, and he asked questions that showed he had heard the previous answer, and he talked himself when she asked him questions about his own life, not evasively but honestly, with a lack of self-aggrandizement that she found remarkably refreshing after some of the men she had encountered in Caldwell, who seemed to believe their own opinions were the most important thing in any room. He told her about Missouri, where he had grown up on a small farm that had struggled through the war years and not much recovered after. His father had died when John was 19, leaving him the farm and his younger sister Clara, and a debt that had taken 3 years of ranch work across Missouri and into Kansas to clear. He had cleared it. He was proud of that in the way a man is proud of a thing he has done quietly and without telling anyone about it. Clara was 16 now and living with their mother's sister in Springfield, attending school, which was what John wanted for her more than anything. He sent money every month and he wrote every 2 weeks. "You miss her," Maria said. "Every day," he said simply. "Does she write back?" He smiled again, that quiet rearranging smile. "She writes back pages. She has a great deal to say, Clara does. She's going to be something, I think. She's the smartest person I know." "Smarter than you. By a considerable margin," he said, without any irony or false modesty, just the flat conviction of a man who had taken an honest measure of both himself and his sister and was comfortable with what he had found. Maria looked at him across the table in the morning light of Ella's eating house and thought, quite clearly, and without trying to think it at all, that she was in very considerable danger. She walked home from Ella's with her hands folded in front of her and the cold November air on her face, and the distinct and unsettling awareness that she had not felt this awake in 2 years. Over the following weeks, the Saturday coffees became a fixed point in Maria's week. The way the Thursday delivery from the dry goods store was a fixed point. The way Sunday Mass was a fixed point. They were reliable. They were looked forward to. Ella Fisher stopped even pretending that the best table was available to anyone else on Saturday mornings. In between Saturdays, John found reasons to be near Donnelly's fine goods on his errands into town. He was not overt about it, not clumsy or obvious, but Maria was a woman who paid attention, and she noted the pattern. And noting it, she felt a warmth that she was beginning to be less afraid of. He fixed the loose board on the boardwalk outside her shop one afternoon without mentioning it, and she only discovered it because she was watching for it and saw the boards were new. He brought her coffee one cold morning when she was in the middle of a complicated cutting job and had forgotten to take her noon meal, setting the cup on the corner of her work table without interrupting her concentration, and then going away again, and she had sat there looking at the coffee for a full minute before she drank it. The town of Caldwell watched all of this with considerable interest. Caldwell was a cattle town, a rough and lively place that sat at the end of the Kishom Trail and saw more than its share of trouble in the summer months when the drives came through. But in November, the trail herds were done for the season, and the town settled into itself, and the permanent residents, who were a close and observant community, had the time to take notice of the developing situation between the Irish seamstress and the quiet ranch hand from Missouri, and to form opinions about it. Mrs. Pettigrew, who was the minister's wife and the most informed person in Caldwell on any subject relating to other people's business, was of the opinion that it was a very suitable match, and said so to anyone who would listen. Old Tom Fremont at the barber shop allowed as how John Granger was a good man, and the Donnelly woman deserved a good man after what she had been through. Ella Fisher simply kept the coffee strong and the pie excellent and let the thing develop at its own pace, which she felt was the most useful thing she could do. Not everyone in Caldwell was equally enthusiastic. There was a man named Douglas Pratt who had been making his interest in Maria Donnelly known for the better part of the 2 years she had been in town, an interest that Maria had met with consistent and polite refusal, but that Pratt seemed incapable of accepting as a final answer. Pratt was 38, a land speculator with money and connections, and the kind of good looks that had probably worked quite well for him in his 20s, and were now becoming aggressive in a face that had grown harder. He ran a small but profitable enterprise in town that involved buying up property when owners were struggling and reselling at significant profit, and he was not a man that other people in Caldwell tended to cross directly. He came into the shop on the second Friday of November, just after John had passed the window and raised his hat, and Maria had found herself smiling before she could prevent it. Pratt watched John's figure moving down the street through the shop window and then turned back to Maria with an expression she did not care for. "I see Granger's still sniffing around," he said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Pratt," Maria said, with all the coolness she could arrange. "Were you after an alteration?" "I'm not here for an alteration. I want to talk to you." He leaned against the counter in a way that blocked some of her light. "I've been patient with you, Maria." "Miss Donnelly," she said. He ignored this. "I've given you time to get settled, to get the shop going. I respect that you wanted to do things your own way, but you've been here 2 years now, and I think it's time you considered a practical arrangement." Maria set down the scissors she was holding. She turned to face him fully, which was a thing she had learned to do with difficult customers and difficult men, giving them her full attention so that there was no confusion about the fact that she was attending to what they were saying. "I have considered it," she said. "I have been considering it since you first mentioned it last spring, and my answer remains the same. I am not interested in a practical arrangement with you, Mr. Pratt. I am not interested in any arrangement with you. I would prefer that you respect that and we continue to exist in this town without difficulty." Pratt's expression tightened. "You're making a mistake." "Perhaps," she said, "but it's mine to make." There was a moment in which she thought he might push further, and she held his gaze without blinking and without stepping back, and after a moment he straightened from the counter and adjusted his coat and left the shop without another word. Maria stood very still after he was gone, her hands steady, her heart somewhat less so. She was not frightened exactly, but she was not easy either. She mentioned none of this to John. It was not his problem to solve, and she had handled it herself, and that was the end of it. But the following Saturday at Ella's, John was quieter than usual for the first part of the morning, and eventually she asked him what was on his mind. He looked at her directly, the way he always did when he was about to say something he had been turning over for a while. "Pratt came to the Hennessy place yesterday," he said. "He was interested in a piece of land that backs up to the south pasture. Business, I suppose, but he said something to me." He paused. "He told me I should be careful about where I spent my time in town." Maria looked at him steadily. "He said that to you?" "He said it the way men say things when they mean something else." John's voice was even, but she could see something underneath the evenness that was controlled carefully. "I want you to know that I'm not going to be careful in that particular way. Not unless you tell me to be. "I'm not going to tell you to be," she said. "Good," he said, and he poured more coffee into both their cups and they moved on to other subjects, but she felt something settle between them after that, something that had been slightly uncertain becoming more certain, and the warmth of it stayed with her through the rest of the day. December came in cold and bright, the plains wind carrying a promise of hard winter, and the cattle at the Hennessy operation were moved to the south pasture where there was more windbreak, which kept John busy through the early part of the month with long days and not many trips to town. Maria missed the Saturday coffees in the first weekend of December when he sent word with one of the other ranch hands that he would not be able to get away. She told herself that the specific heaviness she felt that Saturday morning was tiredness from a long week, and she almost believed it. He came into town the following week on a Wednesday, which was not a usual day, and he came to the shop rather than waiting for Friday, and he asked her if she would come with him to the Christmas social that the Ladies' Aid Society was organizing for the week before Christmas. He asked her directly and without elaborate preparation, standing in the doorway of her shop with his hat in his hands and the December cold coming in around his shoulders, and she said yes before she had quite finished deciding to say it. The Christmas social was the largest social event Caldwell held in the winter season, a dance at the community hall with a fiddle player and a piano and punch that the Ladies' Aid Society made with dried citrus and spices, and the whole town turned out for it. Maria wore the green wool dress she had made herself the previous winter, the best dress she owned, and she put her hair up properly and wore her mother's earbobs, which were small and silver and were the only good jewelry she possessed. John came to her door at 7 o'clock and knocked, and when she opened the door he was standing on her step with his hat in his hand, wearing a dark coat she had not seen before that fit him as though he had acquired it recently, and he looked at her in the green dress with the earbobs, and for a moment he simply looked at her and did not say anything. "You look beautiful," he said then, with the simple directness that was so characteristic of him that the word carried more weight than it would have from someone who embellished more freely. "You look very fine yourself," she said. "Is that coat new?" "Recent," he said, and she saw the slightest color in his face above the collar and she thought that he had bought it for tonight, for this particular evening, and the thought went straight through her like something warm and bright. At the dance, they talked to neighbors and drank the Ladies' Aid punch, and John danced with her twice, which was exactly 2 more times than he had danced with anyone at the autumn church social. And he was not a graceful dancer, but he was careful and steady, which turned out to be exactly what she needed on a crowded floor, and she thought that this was probably true of him in most situations. Douglas Pratt was at the social. He watched them from across the room for most of the first hour with an expression that Maria saw, and then looked away from deliberately, choosing to give her attention to where it was better placed. At the end of the evening, when John walked her home through the cold, clear December night with the stars extraordinarily bright above the prairie, he stopped at her door and they stood on her step and the night was very quiet around them. "Maria," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the miss in front of it, and the sound of it was different from his mouth than it was in her own head. "I want to say something to you." "Say it then," she said. He looked at her with those steady gray eyes, and the starlight was cold and very clear. "I know you're a woman who values her independence," he said carefully. "You've built something here that's yours and you've done it without help, and I respect that more than I can say it. I'm not asking you to change any of that. I wouldn't ask you to change any of that." He paused, and she could see him ordering his words with the care of a man to whom words did not come effortlessly but who understood their importance. "I'm just asking if you might consider the possibility that I could be in your life without taking anything away from it, maybe even adding something to it. And if you could consider it, I'd like to keep spending time with you. I'd like to spend a great deal more time with you." Maria looked up at him in the cold starlit night and she felt that door that had been shifting on its hinges for weeks now open quietly and completely, not with a crash or a flourish, just a steady and inevitable swing inward. "I've already been considering it," she said, "for some time." The relief on his face was visible and immediate and completely unguarded, and that unguardedness was the thing that decided her, because she had known men who were careful about what they showed, and she had generally found that their carefulness was concealing something she would not have liked if she had seen it clearly. John Granger was not hiding anything. He was just a man who felt things deeply and expressed them quietly, and she knew the difference. He kissed her then, briefly and gently, his cold hand cupping her face for a moment, and then he stepped back and wished her a good night, and she went inside and stood in her front room with her coat still on for a considerable time, smiling at the wall in a way that she was glad no one was there to see. Christmas came, and with it a letter from Maria's mother in St. Louis. Her mother Bridget, who was small and fierce, and had raised Maria in the years after they left Ireland, with the conviction that a Donnelly woman did not lean on anything that might give way beneath her. Maria read the letter by her stove on Christmas morning, and then she sat down and wrote a letter back that was the longest she had written since her father's death. And in it, she told her mother about John Granger with a care and a precision that surprised even herself, describing him the way she might describe a garment she was proud of, in terms of its qualities and its construction, and the evidence of the work that had gone into it. Her mother wrote back in January with 3 pages of questions, practical and pointed and entirely characteristic, and Maria answered all of them with equal precision. And by February, Bridget Donnelly had written that she supposed she would need to come to Caldwell and see this man for herself, which Maria took as the highest possible form of maternal approval. In January, the winter settled over the Kansas plains with its full weight, and the days were short and gray, and the wind came screaming off the prairie with nothing to stop it for 500 miles, and the cattle huddled in whatever shelter the Hennessy land provided, and the ranch hands worked through it with the stoic resignation of men who had done this before and would do it again. John came to town when he could, which was not as often as either of them would have liked, but he came when he could, and on the Saturdays when the weather was too fierce for a ride to town, he sent notes that arrived folded into the regular mail, brief and clear and warm, and Maria kept them in the cedar chest with the good silk, and she did not examine her reasons for keeping them too closely. She had a problem with the bank loan in January. She had been making payments faithfully, as she had done every month since her father's death, but the bank's ownership had changed in December, bought out by a larger concern in Wichita, and the new management sent a man to Caldwell in the second week of January with a letter informing her that the terms of her loan had been restructured, and the monthly payment would increase by 40% effective the 1st of March. The increase was legal, or so the man explained, referencing a clause in the original agreement that Maria had not fully understood when she signed it, and her father was already ill, and she had been frightened and tired, and had not asked enough questions. She sat across from the bank man at her work table in the back of the shop with the letter in front of her, and she did not let her face change. "I understand," she said. When the bank man left, she sat for a long time looking at the numbers she scratched out on a piece of paper. The increased payment was not impossible. It was very difficult. It meant she would need to take on significantly more work, which she could do it. It would mean longer hours, and some things she had been putting aside for herself would need to be put aside longer. She could manage it. She had managed harder things. She told John about it the following Saturday at Ella's, not because she wanted him to fix it, but because she had been turning it over alone for a week, and the turning was not helpful, and she had begun to believe that John Granger was someone she could think out loud with. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "Is there anything I can do?" "No," she said. "I just needed to say it to someone who would hear it properly." "I hear it properly," he said. "I know you do." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I can manage it. I want you to know that. I'm telling you because I want you to understand my situation, not because I need you to resolve it." "I know that," he said, with the complete absence of condescension that she had come to understand was one of his essential qualities. "But if that changes, or if you think of something I can do, you'll tell me." "I'll tell you," she said. She took on more work. She stayed later at the shop, sometimes until 8 or 9 in the evening when the light from the oil lamps was hard on her eyes, making up orders she had previously scheduled for the following week, and soliciting new business from the Wellington cattlemen's wives who had been meaning to have alterations done. She added a line of made-to-order men's shirts that she priced sharply and marketed through the barber shop, and Tom Fremont was kind enough to mention her work to the men in his chair, and the business came. She was tired in February in a way that she had not been before, a bone-deep tiredness that she recognized from the year after her father died, though the cause was different now. She pushed through it because she was the sort of woman who pushed through things, but she did not push through it invisibly, not from John. He noticed the shadows under her eyes on the 3rd Saturday of February, and he said nothing about them directly, but he walked her home after Ella's, and he brought wood for her stove and stacked it on the back porch without being asked, working steadily and quietly, until the stack was higher than she had let it get all winter, because buying wood was one of the small economies she had made in her budget restructuring. When he was done, he came inside and washed his hands at her basin, and she made tea, real tea from the tin she kept for Sundays, and they sat at her kitchen table in the cold afternoon light and drank it and talked about Clara, who had written that she intended to become a school teacher, and about the spring that was theoretically coming eventually, somewhere beyond the gray horizon of the Kansas winter. "You're working too hard," he said at one point, quietly, without accusation. "I know," she said, equally quietly. "Is there anything I can do?" She looked at him across the table. The tea was warm in her hands, and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and the winter light outside the window was fading toward early dark. She thought about what she might say to him, what she wanted to say, what was true. "You already do things," she said. "You come and we talk, and that matters more than I know how to say properly." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, briefly and warm, and then took his hand back. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was a thing she carried with her for days afterward. March came in harsh and then softened toward the middle of the month, and the plains began their slow return to life, with the particular stubbornness of plains country that knew winter well and was not to be hurried about abandoning it. The first green appeared in the pastures, and the creek ran high with snowmelt, and the cattle spread out across the Hennessy land, and the work at the ranch shifted into the driven activity of spring that kept the hands busy from before dawn to after dark. In the middle of March, Douglas Pratt made a move that was not subtle. He went to the bank in Wichita, or so Maria learned through the precise information network of a small town, and he had a conversation with the new management there. And the result of that conversation was that Maria received a second letter from the bank informing her that her loan was being called in full, effective the 1st of May, rather than allowed to run to its scheduled completion in November. The sum she owed was not enormous by the standards of some, but it was significantly more than she could raise in 6 weeks without selling the shop, which was not something she could do because the shop was her livelihood. She read the letter sitting at her work table in the back of the shop on a gray March afternoon, and she felt the cold, specific quality of panic that she recognized from the worst moments of the 2 years she had been doing this alone, and she sat very still and breathed through it and let it pass, and then she thought. Pratt, the bank, the timeline. She was not a stupid woman. She understood what she was looking at. She went to see the town lawyer, a man named Harrison Voss, who had an office above the dry goods store and a reputation for straightforwardness. Voss read the letter and the original loan agreement and looked at her over his spectacles. "He can do this," Voss said. "It's irregular and I want to look at it more carefully, but there's language in this original agreement that gives the bank some latitude. Whether that latitude is being used improperly is a different question." He set the papers down. "Do you have reason to believe someone put pressure on the bank to take this action?" "I have a very strong feeling," she said, which is not the same thing. No, he agreed. It's not. He took his spectacles off. Let me write to the Wichita Bank. Sometimes a formal inquiry changes the calculation. She thanked him and left and walked back to the shop through the March mud and the cold, and she went in through the back door and stood in the workroom among her bolts of cloth and her patterned papers, and the dressmaker's form and her father's cedar chest, and the sewing machine that was the finest thing she owned. And she was angry in the way she was very rarely angry, a cold and comprehensive fury that was not at all like panic. John came to town that Friday on his regular errand, and she was in the doorway of the shop when he passed, and he saw her face and stopped. "Tell me," he said. She told him. His expression did not change greatly, but something behind his eyes went still and hard in a way she had not seen before, not alarmed exactly, more like a man who had looked at a situation and made a clear assessment and was now very calm in the specific way that comes from having decided something. "What does Voss say?" he asked. "He's writing to the bank. He says an inquiry might change things. And if it doesn't, then I need to raise the money," she said, "or I find another way." She kept her voice level. "I'm not going to lose this shop." "No," he said, with a certainty that was not performative but simply absolute. "You're not." He came to see her that Saturday evening, not at Ella's, at her house, and he sat at her kitchen table with his hat on the table beside him, and he looked at her with the careful directness she had come to know so well. "I have some savings," he said. 3 years of careful living. It's not the full amount, but it would make up the difference if what you can raise yourself falls short." Maria looked at him for a long time. The kitchen lamp was burning between them, and the night was quiet outside. "I can't take your savings," she said. "It wouldn't be a gift," he said. "I've been thinking about this. I know that you wouldn't accept a gift, and I'm not offering one." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking you something else. I'm asking you something I had planned to ask you differently in better circumstances, and perhaps I should wait, but I don't want to wait, and I don't think the circumstances being different changes what's true." He stopped, and she could see him gathering himself. "I want to marry you, Maria. I've wanted it for months. I want to marry you, and I want to be a partner to you in this shop and everything else, and what I would go toward this loan as a partner's investment, not a charity. That's what I'm offering." The lamp flame moved slightly in the draft from the window, and the kitchen was very warm and very still. "You are not asking me to marry you because of the bank loan," she said carefully. "No," he said without hesitation. "I'm not. The bank loan is a practical problem, and it has practical solutions, and we would find them with or without what I'm proposing. I'm asking you to marry me because I love you, and I have loved you for months, and I believe we would make each other happy for a very long time. The rest is separate." Maria Donnelly was not a woman who cried easily or without cause. She had not cried at the bank letter. She had not cried through the winter's hardest months. She sat across the kitchen table from John Granger and felt something move through her that was not quite tears, but was something in that neighborhood, warm and full and complete. "You love me," she said. "I do," he said simply. "I love you too," she said, and she had not planned to say it exactly that way so directly, but it was true, and he was John, and she was done with being careful about things that were simply true. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his and held them, and she held his back, and they sat that way for a time in the lamplight with the Kansas night outside the window. "Yes," she said. "Yes, to which part?" he asked, and she heard the smile in it. "Both parts," she said. "All of it." Harrison Voss's letter to the Wichita Bank produced an interesting result. It produced a response within 10 days that modified the terms back to something more closely resembling the original agreement, not completely and not without negotiation, but significantly, in a way that suggested that the inquiry had indeed changed someone's calculation somewhere in the chain of events. Whether Douglas Pratt's influence had proven insufficient in the face of a formal legal challenge, or whether the Wichita Bank had its own interest in avoiding a dispute over irregular loan calling, Maria never knew for certain. She suspected both factors had played a role. She and John told Ella Fisher first, because it seemed only right, and Ella put fresh pie on the table without charging for it and pressed Maria's hand warmly, and told John Granger that he was a sensible man, and she had known he would come through eventually, which was not entirely accurate but which he accepted with good grace. They posted the banns at the Catholic church in the nearby town of Winfield, because Caldwell had no Catholic congregation, and they planned the wedding for June, which gave Maria time to complete the wedding dress she intended to make herself, which she began in April on her evenings after the shop closed. Cutting the cream-colored silk by lamplight with the precision she brought to everything, and sewing it piece by piece through the weeks of spring, with the particular care of a woman making the most important garment she had ever constructed. The question of the loan was resolved sufficiently through a combination of John's contribution, which was placed as a proper partnership investment with papers drawn up by Voss to formalize it, and the modified payment terms from the bank and the increased business of the spring season. The shop remained solvent. The shop, as Maria had promised herself in March, was not lost. John wrote to Clara in Springfield, and the letter he received back was, by his account, 3 full pages of unqualified enthusiasm. Clara was planning to attend the wedding. The thought of meeting Clara made Maria happy in a specific and anticipatory way, the way she had always felt about the prospect of sisters, which was something she had not had and had sometimes wanted. April was warm and flowering, and John began spending his days off at Maria's house rather than the bunkhouse, helping with things that needed helping with and being companionably present in the way of a man who had decided where he wanted to be and was now arranging his life accordingly. He fixed the step on her front porch that had been soft for 2 winters. He built a better wood storage on the back of the house, larger and covered, so she would not be cutting back on wood in the next winter's economies. He was not in her way. He seemed to have an instinct for when she wanted company and when she wanted quiet, and in the quiet times he would read on her porch or work at some useful task without requiring her to perform sociability she was not feeling, which was the most restful thing she had found in years. She loved him. She had said it once, and she found it easy to say again, in the way that true things are easy to say when you have committed to saying them. He said it back to her with the same ease, and she thought that some people talked about love as though it were a complicated and fragile thing to be handled carefully, and maybe it was, sometimes, but between her and John it felt more like something solid, something you could rest your weight on without fear. Douglas Pratt left Caldwell in May. The circumstances of his departure were not dramatic, but were satisfying in the specific way that things are satisfying when they resolve themselves, without requiring you to do anything beyond simply standing your ground. He had made several business ventures in the spring that did not work out as intended, and his name had become associated in town conversation with the bank loan situation in a way that did not improve his standing among people who had liked Maria Donnelly and respected what she had built. And after a final conversation with someone, Maria never knew exactly who, he concluded his affairs in Caldwell and moved on to Wichita, where presumably there were other opportunities. Tom Fremont told Maria about his departure with the tone of a man delivering good news, and Maria nodded and thanked him and thought that she was glad to be done with the distraction of him without having had to fight it directly. The June wedding was a thing of considerable warmth. Clara Granger arrived on the train from Wichita, where she had traveled from Springfield with an aunt as chaperone, and she proved to be everything John had described, 16 and bright and full of opinions that she offered with the cheerful confidence of someone who had never found her opinions unwelcome, which was perhaps a small fiction, but which Maria immediately understood was based on the fact that John had always taken her seriously. Clara was tall and had her brother's gray eyes and was deeply interested in everything around her, and she threw her arms around Maria the first evening with a warmth that was so complete and genuine that Maria held on a moment longer than she had planned. "He writes about you all the time," Clara told her in the frank way she had. "He doesn't say much, but he says a lot between the lines. I've been hoping you would say yes since October." "Since October," Maria repeated, laughing a little. "He only started asking me to coffee in November. He was making up his mind in October," Clara said wisely. "When John makes up his mind, it's already done. The asking is just the last part." The wedding was at the Winfield Church on a Saturday morning in the third week of June, 1880, with the Kansas summer already warm and the prairie grasses tall and golden. Maria's mother, Bridget, had come from St. Louis on the train, small and fierce and slightly overwhelmed by the heat and the openness of the plains, and she had looked at John Granger for a long time on the evening before the wedding with the measuring gaze of a woman who had lived by her own standards for many years and was not easily impressed. "You'll be good to her," Bridget said. It was not a question. "Every day," John said. Bridget looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Your hands are working hands," which was not perhaps the most conventional approval, but which Maria understood meant that her mother had seen what she needed to see. Maria made the journey to the church in the old Hennessy wagon that John had borrowed and decorated impractically, but sweetly with wildflowers that Clara had gathered. And she wore the cream silk dress that was the finest thing she had ever made, fitted perfectly, because she had made it herself and knew every measurement and every seam. And she walked into the small Catholic church with the June light coming through the windows in long, warm angles, and she saw John standing at the front of the church in his good coat with his hands at his sides, and he looked at her coming down the aisle with an expression that was completely unguarded and entirely without performance, and she felt herself smile in the way she smiled most naturally, which was not a careful or social smile but the real thing, full and unreserved. The priest was Father Ambrose, a middle-aged man with a dry manner and genuine kindness who had married cattlemen and merchants and farmers in this church for a decade, and who performed the ceremony with simple and moving dignity. They said their vows in the traditional words that had been said by generations of people before them, and the words felt new anyway, felt specific to the two of them and the particular path they had taken to this moment. The Saturday mornings at Ella's, and the rain on the boardwalk, and the November night on her doorstep, and the March kitchen table, and all of it leading here. Bridget Donnelly cried quietly in the front pew. Clara Granger cried less quietly and blew her nose with cheerful efficiency. Old Tom Fremont, who had come down from Caldwell for the occasion, looked as though he might have had something in his eye. Ella Fisher had come as well and brought 2 pies. After the wedding there was a meal at the church hall, long tables set up with food brought by people who knew and liked the Grangers or the Donnellys or both. And it was not a grand affair, but it was a full and warm one, with laughter and the sort of conversation that happens when people are genuinely happy for the occasion that has brought them together. John danced with Maria properly for the first time, in the sense that there was no one watching who mattered except each other. And he was still not graceful, but he held her close and moved carefully, and she thought that of all the things she appreciated about him, the carefulness was among the foremost. The way he attended to what was in front of him as though it mattered, as though she mattered, as though there was nothing elsewhere that could claim his attention more legitimately. They returned to Caldwell as Mr. and Mrs. Granger, which Maria found she had fewer feelings about the name change than she had anticipated, having assumed she would feel the loss of Donnelly more sharply. She mentioned this to John on the second evening of their marriage, sitting at the kitchen table that was now their kitchen table, and he listened and then said, "Donnelly is a fine name and it doesn't stop being yours. The shop is still Donnelly's Fine Goods if that's what you want." She looked at him. "You don't mind? It's your father's name in your shop," he said. "Why would I mind?" It was such a plain and complete answer that she leaned across the table and kissed him, which surprised him slightly and pleased him considerably, and the shop remained Donnelly's Fine Goods. The summer of 1880 was full. John had a conversation with William Hennessy about his situation, and Hennessy, who was a practical man and a fair one, moved John from general ranch hand to foreman of the North Pasture operation, which came with better pay and a small foreman's house on the property that they did not use because Maria's house was where the shop was, and there was no sense in moving. John rode out to the ranch most days before first light and was home by late afternoon except in the busy seasons, and the rhythm of their days settled into something that suited them both. Maria at the shop through the day and John back by evening, and the evenings together in the small house that was becoming, by degrees, genuinely theirs. Clara wrote longer letters than ever, addressed now to both of them, and in September she sent a letter announcing that she had been accepted into a teacher training program in Springfield, which was exactly what she had wanted, and John read the letter at the kitchen table, and Maria saw his face, and the pride in it was the particular pride of someone who has worked toward something for a long time and is watching it arrive. "She's going to be wonderful," Maria said. "She already is," he said. In the autumn of 1880, Maria discovered she was expecting a child. She sat with the knowledge for a week before she told John, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she wanted to know her own feelings about it first, before the telling changed things. She knew she was glad. She knew she was also frightened in the way of anyone facing something large and new, and she knew that both of those things were legitimate and that she did not have to choose between them. She told him on a Sunday evening when they were sitting on the porch in the last warmth of the Oklahoma autumn, watching the sky go orange and red over the plains. He went very still when she told him, in the way he went still when something mattered greatly. Then he turned to her with his whole face open in a way she had only seen a few times, and he took her hands in both of his. "Are you all right?" he asked first. "Yes," she said, "I'm very well. Are you happy?" And the way he asked it, the careful respect for her answer, the understanding that her happiness was not automatic even in good news, was so exactly what she needed him to ask that she felt the tears come that she had been managing not to let come all week. "I am," she said. "I am very happy. And also a little afraid." "I'm a little afraid too," he said quietly. "But I think we'll be all right. I think we'll be better than all right." She believed him. It was not naive belief, not the belief of someone who had not looked at the world clearly. It was the belief of a woman who had watched this man for more than a year, in all the varieties of ordinary circumstance, and found him consistently to be exactly what he appeared to be. There was no other shoe to drop. There was no other version of him waiting behind the face he showed her. He was what he was, and what he was enough, was more than enough, was exactly right. The winter of 1880 was less harsh than the previous year, or perhaps it only felt less harsh because she was not carrying it alone. John was attentive in the practical way that was his nature, making sure the wood supply was never low and the stove was drawing well, and that she was eating properly, because she found in the first months of the pregnancy that she had lost some appetite, and he had developed a talent for making simple food appealing by sheer persistence and variety. He was not anxious about the pregnancy in a way that translated into hovering, but he was watchful in a quiet way that she appreciated, checking in without checking up, present without pressing. The shop did well that winter. Maria had hired a part-time assistant, a young woman named Agnes Whitfield, who was 17 and quiet, and had an unexpected talent for hand stitching that Maria had recognized on the first day. Agnes had come in asking if there was any work. Agnes was the daughter of one of the smaller cattle families north of town, a family that was struggling in the way. A lot of smaller operations were struggling in those years as the cattle trade centralized, and the money Agnes earned made a real difference to them, which was a thing Maria was glad of. Agnes turned out to be good company through the winter days, quiet but present, and Maria found that she was thinking about her father more in those months, about what it meant to give someone skills and a start, about the shop as something more than just her livelihood. Her father had built something, and then the fever had taken him from it, and she had carried it forward. And now she was teaching Agnes the work, and the work would go on beyond her the way work does when it is done with care and passed along carefully. She wrote long letters to her mother in St. Louis through the winter, and Bridget wrote back with practical advice about the pregnancy. Some of it from a decade and a half before, and some of it still entirely sensible. And Maria read her mother's handwriting and heard her mother's voice in it, and felt the particular warmth of being known by someone who had known you your whole life. John wrote to Clara about the baby, and Clara's response arrived by return post, which suggested she had written it the same day, and was full of declarations of intention to be the finest aunt in the history of Missouri and Kansas combined, which Maria read aloud to John over the supper table, and they laughed together in the kitchen lamplight, easy and warm. The spring of 1881 came on slowly and then all at once, the way prairie spring does, weeks of cold and gray, and then a week of warmth that brought everything out at once, the grasses and the wildflowers and the creek full and singing, and the sky that particular limitless blue that Maria had come to love about Kansas, the sky that made you feel the whole world was open in every direction. Their son was born in April of 1881. He arrived on a Tuesday morning early, while the light was still coming up gray over the prairie, and the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Carver, who had delivered half the children in the county, presided with efficient warmth over the proceedings in the upstairs room of Maria and John's house, while John was not precisely downstairs, because he found he could not be very far from the room, and he paced the hallway outside the door with the controlled and focused concern of a man who wanted very much to be doing something useful, and had been firmly instructed that he was not needed inside and should wait. He was a healthy boy, a good size, with a full head of dark hair that was clearly his mother's contribution, and eyes that in the first days were the undefined color of all newborns, but which within the first month resolved to a clear and definitive gray. "He has your eyes," Maria said, on the morning after the birth, the baby in her arms and John sitting on the edge of the bed beside her with the particular expression of a man whose world has just been reorganized completely and who is not yet sure he has the vocabulary for it. "He has your hair," John said. "He has both of us," she said. John looked at the baby for a long time with those gray eyes that the baby was going to have. The baby was sleeping. His small face had the concentrated peace of the newborn, the face of something that has come from somewhere very far away and has not yet quite arrived, and John put out one careful finger and the baby's tiny hand closed around it reflexively, and the expression on John's face was something Maria did not have the words for, something vast and still and entirely open. "Patrick," Maria said. "I would like to call him Patrick." She saw John's face move. "After your father," he said, "if you're agreed." He looked up from the baby to her. "I'm agreed," he said, and his voice was a little rough. "Patrick Granger, it's a good name." "It's a very good name," she said. Patrick Donnelly Granger, named for a tailor from County Clare who had believed in good clothes and new chances, grew in the house in Caldwell with the solidity of a child who was well loved and knew it, which gave him a quality of settled happiness that people would remark on later as the thing they most remembered about him as a boy. He was even-tempered and curious, and from the time he could sit up and pay attention, he was interested in everything around him with a comprehensive and unstoppable interest that kept his parents fully occupied and Ella Fisher supplied with visitors, because Maria often stopped in at the eating house on her way home from the shop with Patrick on her hip, and Ella Fisher had decided opinions about the proper nutrition of growing children. The shop continued. Agnes Whitfield proved to be genuinely talented, and Maria spent more time teaching her and less time at the purely mechanical work, which left Maria's capacity for the more complex and creative pieces, the wedding dresses, and the formal gowns that were still her best work. And the shop's reputation continued to build through 1881 and into 1882. And by 1882, There was a waiting list for Maria's wedding dresses that stretched 3 months out, and she had helped Agnes design a small line of ready-made children's clothes that sold steadily through the dry goods store. John's foreman position at Hennessy's grew in scope and responsibility, and Hennessy talked to him in the winter of 1881 about a partnership arrangement that would allow John to acquire a portion of the operation over time. It was not a simple thing, and the terms required careful negotiation, but Voss helped with the papers, and the arrangement was finalized by the spring of 1882, which meant that John was now a part owner of the land he had been working for 3 years, a thing he had not dared to plan for directly but had hoped for in the particular way he hoped for things, without pressure, steadily, with patience. They bought the lot behind Maria's house, and in the summer of 1882 they built a proper addition, 2 rooms and a larger kitchen, because the house that had been sufficient for Maria alone, and then for the 2 of them, was becoming crowded with Patrick, and with the general accumulation of a life being fully lived. John did much of the building himself with help from 2 of the Hennessy hands and Tom Fremont's nephew, who was a decent carpenter, and Maria designed the kitchen to her specifications, which included a window in the precise position to catch the morning light. And the kitchen, when it was finished, was the best room in the house, and the room they spent the most time in. Bridget Donnelly came to Caldwell in the summer of 1882, making the train journey from St. Louis with the determination of a woman who has decided it is time to properly assess a situation. She stayed for 3 weeks. She held Patrick and approved of him. She watched John with the same measuring attention she had applied to him before the wedding, and her assessment, delivered to Maria on the 2nd week of the visit while John was at the ranch and Patrick was asleep, was characteristically plain. "He's a good man," Bridget said. "You can see it in how he is with the boy and how he is with you. He doesn't try to make himself larger than he is." "No," Maria agreed. "He doesn't." "Your father would have liked him," Bridget said, which was the highest thing she could say, and both of them knew it. They sat in the new kitchen in the summer morning light and drank tea and talked about Patrick Donnelly, who had been Maria's father and Bridget's husband, who had believed in new chances and built something with his hands and left it to his daughter, and the shop across town bore his name still and always would, and the grandson he had never met bore his name too, and the continuity of it was something Maria felt in those moments as a presence rather than a loss, which was not something she had expected grief to become, but which she was grateful for. Clara Granger finished her teacher training in Springfield in 1882 and was offered a position at a school in Kansas City, which was closer than Springfield, and which she accepted with enthusiasm. She came to Caldwell for Christmas that year, her first time visiting since the wedding, and she was not any more the bright 16-year-old, but a composed and energetic young woman of 18 who had opinions about the education of children that were substantially ahead of current practice, and which she held with charming firmness. She adored Patrick with an energy that Patrick found stimulating and exhausting in approximately equal measure, and she and Maria fell into the easy friendship that Maria had hoped for, and that felt entirely natural. On Christmas Eve, sitting in the kitchen after Patrick had been put to bed and John had banked the stove, Clara said, with the directness that was the family trait, "I'm very glad he found you." Maria looked at her across the table. "He told me once that you were the smartest person he knows." Clara smiled, the same smile as John's, that quiet, rearranging smile. "He's right," she said, "but you're a close second." John, coming in from the back porch, caught the end of this exchange and looked between them with the expression of a man who has recognized that he is outnumbered and is completely comfortable with the situation. The years moved as years do when they are good ones, not quickly or slowly, but with the particular rhythm of a life that is full of real things. There was work, and there was the pleasure of work well done. There was the shop and the ranch and the house and the town around them, Caldwell growing and changing as the trail drive era began to wind toward its end, and the town found new purposes, a railroad spur and a growing permanent population, and the new school that was built in 1883, to which Patrick Granger would go in due course. In the spring of 1883, Maria found she was expecting again. She was 28, healthy and strong, and she received the news with the equanimity of someone who has navigated something large once and knows what she is doing. She told John at the kitchen table, the morning light coming through the east window the way she had designed it, and he smiled at her with the full warmth of a man who has been lucky once and is being told he is lucky again. "How are you?" he asked. "Very well," she said. "And glad." "Me too," he said. "Very." Their daughter arrived in October of 1883, 7 months after they knew she was coming, with a competency and lack of unnecessary drama that reminded John, who said so, of her mother. "She wanted to get on with it," Maria said. "Just like you," he said. They named her Bridget Clara Granger, for both the grandmothers of the women who had shaped John and Maria respectively, and the name pleased Bridget Donnelly in St. Louis enormously, and pleased Clara Granger in Kansas City equally, and both of them came to Caldwell for the christening, which was held at the Winfield Church on a November Sunday with the prairie brown and gold around them, and the sky very high and clear. Patrick Granger, who was 2.5 years old at his sister's christening, regarded the baby with the solemn and slightly skeptical attention of a child who has been informed that his life is about to change and is reserving judgment. Within 3 weeks, he had appointed himself her primary guardian and could generally be found wherever she was, which was a thing that made John laugh with the specific delight of a man watching his children be themselves. The shop had by 1884 grown to a point where Agnes Whitfield was essentially the assistant manager, handling the day-to-day work with 2 other local women they had taken on part-time, and Maria spent her mornings at the shop and her afternoons at home with the children, which was an arrangement she had arrived at by her own choice, and which suited her better than any other configuration she had considered. She was still the one who took the most important commissions, the wedding dresses and the formal work, because that work was hers, and she was not ready to hand it to anyone else, and she did not think she would be ready for a long time. John's partnership at Hennessy's had been going well through these years, and Hennessy himself, who was getting older, had conversations with John in the winter of 1883 about the eventual transfer of a larger share of the operation. Hennessy had no sons, and his daughter had married a banker in St. Louis and had no interest in Kansas cattle, and he had watched John Granger work his land for 5 years with the attention and care of a man who understood what he was working with, and he trusted him with it in the way that ranchers trust very few people with the land they have made their lives in. In the spring of 1884, Hennessy transferred the majority of the operation to John through a formal agreement brokered by Voss, retaining a modest income for himself in his retirement, and John Granger became, at 32, the primary operator of what was now called the Granger Ranch, which was 1,100 acres of good Kansas land, and more cattle than he had ever imagined managing when he had arrived in Caldwell 5 years before on a roan gelding with a worn coat and a letter of introduction. He told Maria about it the evening the papers were signed, coming home from Voss's office in the late afternoon with the documents in his coat pocket and the particular stillness on him of a man who is processing something large. She looked at him across the kitchen while Bridget was sleeping in her basket, and Patrick was playing on the floor with the wooden blocks that John had made him last winter. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He laid it out plainly, the terms and the acreage and what it meant going forward. When he was done, she came around the table and stood in front of him and put her hands on either side of his face, which was something she did sometimes when she wanted him to be still and present and hear her. "Your father would be proud of you," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I hope so," he said. "I'm proud of you," she said. "I have been for a long time." He covered her hands with his own, and they stood that way in the kitchen of their home, with the evening light going gold through the window that she had designed to catch the light. And Patrick stacked his blocks with great concentration on the floor, and Bridget slept in her basket, and the papers of the Granger ranch were in John's coat pocket, and the shop across town bore her father's name and would keep bearing it, and they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Old Tom Fremont retired from the barber shop in 1884 and his nephew took it over, and at his retirement party in the community hall Tom made a speech that was brief because he was not a man for speeches, and that contained, near the end, a reference to John and Maria Granger that was simply this: "They're the best thing that's happened to this town since the railroad," which was high praise from a man who valued the railroad considerably, and it was received with the warm agreement of a room full of people who thought about it and found that they substantially agreed. Maria wrote to her mother in St. Louis with the regularity she had maintained since coming to Caldwell, and the letters from St. Louis came back with equal regularity, and they were the connective tissue of a relationship between two very similar women who expressed their affection in the practical language of shared information and honest opinion. Bridget Donnelly came to Caldwell twice a year, spring and autumn, and she was part of the children's lives in the way of a grandmother who is absolutely certain of her importance and acts accordingly, which Patrick and Bridget Clara found entirely appropriate, and which Maria thought was exactly the inheritance her father would have wanted to leave. A grandmother who showed up and took charge and made everything feel slightly more organized. In the summer of 1885, something happened that reminded Maria and John both, briefly, of how small the margin of good fortune could sometimes be. One of the Granger ranch hands, a young man named Eli Boone, was badly hurt in an accident with a fence post and a spooked horse, and the injury was serious enough that there was real concern through the first week. John spent those nights at the ranch, near enough to be useful, and Maria ran the household alone with the children and the shop, and the week stretched in a way that brought back the memory of the long months before John, the long months of the house alone after her father, and she was glad when the week was over and Eli Boone was clearly going to recover, and she was glad when John came home. They sat on the porch the evening he came back properly, the children asleep inside, and the summer night was warm and the stars were very bright, and she leaned against him and he put his arm around her and they sat in the quiet for a long time. "I don't take this for granted," she said. "I know you don't," he said. "Neither do I." "Good," she said, "as long as we both know." He pressed his lips to the top of her head very gently, and the night went on around them, warm and full of crickets, the way Kansas summer nights are when they are at their best, large and alive and completely present. The Granger ranch grew in the latter half of the 1880s, as John managed it with the careful attention that was his fundamental quality, not flashy expansion but steady building, the kind that holds. He added a good breeding stock program in 1886, and the quality of the Granger cattle became known in a way that meant the buyers came to him rather than the other way around, which was a position he valued for the independence it gave him. He hired well and kept his hands by paying fairly and treating them as people whose skill and time mattered, which was not universal practice, and which meant he had less turnover than most operations his size, and consequently a crew that knew the land and the cattle the way you only know things you have worked with for years. Maria's shop added a small ready-to-wear line for children in 1886 that sold widely, not only in Caldwell, but through a wholesale arrangement with a dry goods distributor in Wichita that Agnes had negotiated with an acuity that confirmed Maria's confidence in her. Agnes Whitfield, who was now 23 and had turned down 2 marriage proposals from men Maria had privately assessed as not nearly good enough for her, ran the shop day to day with a capability that had long since moved from assistant to partner, and the formal partnership papers that Maria had Voss draw up in 1887 made official what had been true in practice for some time. Agnes was briefly and completely in love with a young lawyer who arrived in Caldwell in the spring of 1887, a quiet man named Thomas Aldred, who had come west from Ohio with a law degree and a constitution that was better suited to the West than to Ohio, and who had the particular quality of listening carefully that Maria recognized and approved of. He and Agnes were engaged by summer and married in the autumn, and the wedding dress was made by Maria herself, who refused to allow it to be otherwise, and it was the finest dress she had ever made. Patrick Granger started school in 1887 and took to it immediately with the comprehensive curiosity that had characterized him from infancy, and his teacher sent home a note in his first month informing his parents that he was reading considerably above his level and would benefit from additional materials, which John provided by writing to a bookseller in Kansas City and ordering a selection that arrived in a large parcel, and which Patrick worked through with a focused intensity that made both his parents quietly hopeful. Bridget Clara, who was 4 in 1887, was a different creature from her brother, less methodical and more spontaneous, with a physical fearlessness that had required her parents to develop a different kind of attention than they had developed with Patrick. She climbed things. She moved fast. She was interested in the horses at the ranch with a focused intensity that John recognized as something to be taken seriously, and he began teaching her to ride properly when she was 4.5 on the oldest and steadiest horse on the ranch, a bay mare named Constance who had the temperament of a saint, and Bridget Clara sat on Constance with the natural ease of someone who has been waiting for this particular experience and recognized it immediately as something she was meant to do. "She's going to ride everything on this ranch," John told Maria. "I know," Maria said. "Let her." He looked at her. "You're not worried." "I'm always slightly worried," she said. "But I'm not going to let that stop her." He smiled the quiet smile. "She's like you," he said. "She's like both of us," Maria said. "The best parts." The year 1888 brought a hard winter, harder than any since Maria's early years in Caldwell, and the cattle losses across the county were significant. The Granger Ranch lost fewer than most, because John had been building windbreaks on the north side of the property since he had taken over the operation, and the sheltered areas held the herd through the worst weeks. But it was not without loss, and the recovery through the spring was demanding. Maria kept the shop running steadily through the winter, the women's clothing business being less dependent on weather than the cattle trade, and the shop's income was a genuine stabilizer through the months when the ranch was absorbing losses. They talked about money the way partners talk about money, plainly and without drama, understanding that the shop and the ranch were both theirs, and that the months when one was stronger would support the months when the other was weaker. And this was not a thing they had ever formally decided, but a thing that had simply become true and was now the foundation of how they managed. By the spring of 1889, the ranch had recovered fully and was doing better than it had been before the hard winter, partly because some of the smaller operations that had not survived the winter's losses had sold land that John was able to acquire at fair prices, expanding the ranch's acreage to something over 1,500 acres, and partly because the breeding program had been producing for 3 years now, and the quality of the Granger stock was established and valued. That spring was also the spring that Maria, at 34, found herself expecting for the third time. She was quiet about it for longer than she had been with either of the first two, not from reluctance but from the desire to sit with it in the way she had sat with things before. She told John on a May evening on the porch with the prairie evening spread out in front of them and the children inside at the supper table with all the attendant noise of children at supper. "Again," she said simply. He looked at her. The evening light was long and gold on the grass. "And how are you?" "Glad," she said. "And aware that we will have 3 children, which is a lot of children." "It is," he agreed. "Are you glad?" He took her hand, which was the answer, but he also said, "Yes, very." "Good," she said. "Then we're agreed." Their second son arrived in December of 1889, on a cold night with the stars very bright, and they named him James Patrick Granger, the Patrick for Maria's father again, and the James for no particular reason, except that they both liked the sound of it, and it suited the small and robust person who arrived with considerably more noise than his sister had, but with a similarly purposeful air. Patrick was 8 when his brother was born, and regarded him with a scholarly interest that quickly became fond protection. Bridget Clara was 6 and had strong opinions about the baby from the first day, and communicated them at length to anyone who would listen, which in her experience was everyone. The family in the house in Caldwell, with the shop 2 streets over and the ranch to the south, and the school where Patrick was increasingly remarkable, and the stable where Bridget Clara was increasingly at home, was a full and growing and deeply rooted thing by the turn of the decade. They stood one evening in the autumn of 1890, Maria and John, at the window of the upstairs room of the house, looking out over Caldwell in the evening light. The town had grown and changed through the decades since they had met in this town, the cattle drives diminishing as the rail lines pushed further west and changed the calculus of the trade, and the town was reinventing itself in the steady way of places that intend to survive. There was a proper school and 2 churches and a doctor's office and a newer bank that was not the bank that had caused her trouble in 1880, and Donnelly's Fine Goods was the most established and respected business of its kind for 50 miles, and the Granger Ranch was known throughout the county for the quality of what it produced. "Do you remember the rain?" Maria said. He looked at her. "Which rain?" "The November rain, the first year, when you stood outside the shop for an hour in the rain waiting to walk me home." He was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the town in the evening. "I remember it," he said. "I never asked you to do that," she said. "No," he said, "you didn't." She turned to look at him. The lamplight from the room was warm on both their faces, and outside the window the prairie evening was going deep blue and gold. "Why did you?" she asked. He considered this the way he considered things that mattered, with genuine attention. "Because you were in there working," he said, "and the rain was coming down, and I wanted to walk you home. And I couldn't think of a reason not to." He looked at her. "That's all it was." She thought about the woman she had been in that November of 1879, the woman who had looked out her shop window and seen a cowboy standing in the rain that she had not asked to be there, and she thought about the door that had shifted on its hinges in that moment and the long, good, full opening that had followed. "I was watching you," she said, "through the window, before I opened the door. You were just standing there, and you weren't looking in, you weren't making a show of it, you were just there." "I was just there," he agreed. "That was when," she said. "When what?" "When I knew," she said, "or began to. That you were different from other things I might have been careful about." He looked at her for a long time in the lamplight, the way he had looked at her in 100 lamplight moments over the years, with the steady, unperformed attention that was among the things she loved most about him. "I was already gone by then," he said, "had been for weeks." "I know," she said. "I could tell even then. And it didn't frighten you off. You were standing in the rain," she said. "The patience of it. That's what kept me from being frightened. I could see you would not push." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair that had escaped her arrangement back behind her ear, his touch as careful as it had always been, careful in the way that things are careful when they matter greatly. "Maria," he said. "John," she said, and smiled. Downstairs, one of the children called out something, Bridget Clara's voice by the volume and confidence of it, and they both registered it and registered that it was not urgency, only announcement, and they had the specific parental ability to categorize the difference. "We should go down," she said. "We should," he agreed. But they stood there another moment at the window with Caldwell spread out below them, and the years of their life together solid and real around them. The shop with her father's name on it, and the ranch that had grown under his hands, and the 3 children who were all of them and none of them, who were their own people already in the way that children are when they are raised to be themselves, and the morning coffee at Ella's that still happened on Saturdays when they could manage it. Ella being still alive and still making pie that was the best thing in the county, and the letters from Clara, who was teaching in Kansas City, and writing long accounts of her students that were the best. Letters either of them received, and the visits from Bridget Donnelly, who arrived twice a year and made everything feel slightly more organized, and all of it gathered around this moment at the window in the autumn evening light. She took his hand, not for any reason except that his hand was there and she wanted to hold it, and he held hers back, and then they went downstairs together to the full and living house. That is where the story properly ends, though of course it did not end there, because life does not end at its finest moments but continues through and past them into new seasons. Patrick Granger would become a lawyer, eventually. After a time of thinking he might become a doctor, and another time of thinking he might follow his father onto the land. And the lawyer turned out to be what was true, and he moved to Wichita and had a practice that Maria thought her father, who had believed in new chances, would have been enormously pleased by. Bridget Clara Granger would eventually manage the ranch herself during the years when John's health required him to step back, and she would do it with a competency that was not surprising to anyone who had been paying attention since the days of the old bay mare named Constance. James Patrick Granger would grow up to be a rancher like his father, steady and careful and deeply attached to the land, and the Granger ranch would pass through his hands to his children in the fullness of time. But all of that is future, and the story is in the present of that autumn evening at the window, and the present of the November rain in 1879, when a cowboy stood outside a dress shop waiting to walk a woman home who had never asked him to, because he saw what needed doing and he did it. And she was a woman who looked out and recognized what she was seeing, and the door shifted on its hinges, and everything that followed was the consequence of that long, patient, rain-soaked hour in November, which was perhaps the finest hour of John Granger's life, and which he had never regretted for a single moment in all the years that came after it. Maria Donnelly had not asked him to stand in the rain. She was glad, every day for the rest of her life, that he had stood there anyway.